They never meant for this story to surface. Families like theirs survive on silence, on secrets kept buried so deep they rot beneath the soil without ever seeing the light of day. But every now and then, time itself loosens its grip, and the past forces its way to the surface like a corpse rising from a forgotten grave. What you're about to hear isn't myth, it isn't folklore. It was whispered in courtrooms, hidden in old census records, and concealed in diaries that should never have been found. It is the story of a young woman whose life was twisted into something unthinkable, because the man she loved, the man who fathered her child, was the same man who raised her, her own grandfather. The first sign of something unnatural always begins small, a neighbor noticing how much time she spent with him, a preacher uneasy at the way his hand lingered too long on her shoulder. People noticed, but no one dared speak it out loud, not then, because in towns like theirs, the rules of morality bent beneath the weight of bloodlines, and the church bells rang loud enough to drown out the screams of those who suffered inside their own homes. She was born into a family already tangled in itself, cousins who were also siblings, uncles who doubled as stepfathers. The lines on the family tree twisted until it looked less like a tree and more like a noose. Her mother was barely more than a child when she gave birth, and her father had disappeared before she was old enough to remember his face. That left her grandfather as the only steady figure in her young life, a man who should have been protector, guide, and shield. Instead, he became the predator who rewrote her destiny. By the time she was a teenager, whispers had grown into suspicion, the way they disappeared together for hours at a time, the sudden weight of her silence when anyone mentioned marriage or boys her own age. She never confessed, but her eyes carried a heaviness, a shame that couldn't be hidden, and in that silence the town looked away, as it always had. But then she gave birth, and when the child opened his eyes, the resemblance to his grandfather was so strong that the whispers turned into gasps. The secret that was never meant to see daylight had been forced into the world, breathing, crying, undeniable. The birth of that child should have been a moment of joy, but instead it was the sound of chains tightening. Neighbors who had once turned their eyes away now watched with unease, though still none dared to say the words out loud. Families in places like theirs were trained to keep their mouths shut, because if one house was exposed, how many more would follow? Yet, in that baby's face, the entire rotten history of the bloodline was written. His jawline mirrored the grandfather's, his pale eyes carried the same strange droop. People said the child looked older than his years, even as an infant, as though he had been born already carrying the sins of the family. The young mother clung to him with a desperate kind of love, the love of someone who knew she was both mother and sister, daughter and granddaughter. Every time she looked at him, she saw her own ruin, but she also saw the only soul in the world who truly belonged to her. To admit the truth of his father would have been to destroy herself completely, so she stayed silent. Silence was safer than justice, because justice in those days rarely came for women like her. Her grandfather did not treat the child as an abomination. To him, the boy was proof of his dominance, a living reminder that his bloodline would continue unbroken, no matter how twisted the path. He carried the child through town with pride, smiling at those who dared not look him in the eyes. And that smile, that smug, satisfied grin, is what finally started to fracture the community's silence. Old men who had grown up with him remembered strange things from their youth, the way his family, too, had always kept their daughters close. Too close. Old church records hinted at marriages that were never quite right, ages that never quite matched. And though few would admit it openly, some began to suspect that what happened to her was not the first two. Only the first time anyone could no longer deny it. She would spend her nights alone, listening to the child's breathing in the dark, wondering if one day he would come to understand what he truly was. Would he resent her? Would he curse her for bringing him into a world already against him? Or would he become like the man who made him, repeating the cycle, passing down the curse like a family heirloom that could never be destroyed? Time has a way of deepening silence into rot. As the child grew, the story of his birth became a stain that could not be washed out. Families in town kept their distance. Children weren't allowed to play with him, not because he had done anything wrong, but because of what he represented. He was a reminder, walking proof that evil doesn't always wear horns or carry a weapon. Sometimes it hides behind the title of grandfather. The girl, now a mother before she was even truly a woman, withdrew further from the world. She rarely spoke, rarely smiled, and never lifted her eyes in church. People began to whisper about her health, saying she carried a sickness inside her bones, though the sickness was not of the body, but of the soul. Her skin grew pale, her hair lost its shine, and she began to resemble a ghost drifting through her own life. Her grandfather still held power in the house. To the outside world, he was a man of labor, steady, dependable, even respected. No one dared speak of what they suspected, but inside those walls, he remained the shadow that stretched across every corner. He told her what to do, when to eat, when to sleep, and when to smile for appearances. He was both captor and kin, and she was too entangled to escape. The family name was the chain around her neck, and every time she considered breaking free, she thought of the boy and of the shame that would follow him if the truth ever came fully to light. There were nights when neighbors claimed to hear screaming from the house, sharp and quick before being cut off. Others said they saw her in the fields, running, only to return home before dusk, as if she had been pulled back by some invisible rope. And though rumors grew, no one came to her aid. In places like theirs, help did not come for young women tainted by their own bloodlines. What is most haunting is that she began to accept it. She stopped fighting. She let the silence swallow her because it was the only way to survive. But survival has a cost, and in her eyes you could see it, a dull emptiness, like she was watching her life play out from far away, powerless to alter its course. And all the while, the child kept growing. Each year he looked more like the man who had made him. Each year the truth grew harder to bury. And soon, that truth would rise in a way that no one, not even the grandfather, could control. It began with the boy's face. By the time he was 8 or 9, the resemblance to his grandfather was no longer something that could be whispered about in kitchens or exchanged in hushed tones after church. It was undeniable, the curve of the nose, the slope of the jaw, the piercing blue-gray eyes that never seemed to soften. When he walked beside the old man, it was like looking at two shadows cast from the same figure, one stretched small, the other tall. People turned away in the street, but not before their eyes betrayed the disgust they carried. The boy noticed. Children always notice. He asked his mother why others didn't want to sit with him, why the teacher's hand trembled when she corrected his papers, why even the preacher seemed to stumble over his words when addressing him by name. And every time he asked, his mother grew pale and told him only, "It isn't your fault." But the words rang hollow because he could see in her eyes that part of her believed it was. By then the grandfather had grown bolder. He carried himself like a man who had conquered not just his family, but the silence of an entire town. He dared anyone to speak, and no one did. His pride in the boy bordered on obsession, taking him everywhere, placing him in plain sight, as if daring God himself to intervene. But the higher a man builds his own throne, the further the fall when the collapse comes, and the collapse was coming. It started when the boy reached his adolescence. Strange things began to happen. Sudden fits of rage, confusion that bordered on delirium, long stretches where he would stare into nothing with eyes wide open. Some said it was madness, that the blood inside him had carried the curse too far. Others whispered it was guilt passed down through generations, a sickness born not in the body but in the soul. Whatever the cause, it made the town fearful. They began to say, aloud, though only behind closed doors, that the family was cursed, that the grandfather had poisoned his own line and doomed them all. And for the mother, this was the deepest cut. She watched the boy she had once held as her only light become the vessel of everything she feared. The resemblance to his father, her grandfather, was no longer just physical. It was in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the dark look that crossed his face when anger stirred. She began to wonder if she had given birth not to a son, but to a continuation of the very evil that had destroyed her life. By the time the boy turned 15, the town could no longer pretend the family's curse was just rumor. His fits grew violent. Once he struck another child with a stone so hard the boy never walked right again. Another time he was found standing outside the church long after midnight, barefoot, mumbling to himself, his eyes glazed like he was speaking to ghosts. Some said the blood inside him was finally tearing itself apart, that the generations of inbreeding had carved fissures in his mind. Others believed darker things, that he had inherited not just the face of his grandfather, but his hunger too. The mother, gaunt and hollow, began to fear her own son. She prayed over him at night, whispering words that were less like blessings and more like desperate bargains with God. She begged that he be spared from repeating the sins of his bloodline, that he not grow into the very man who had ruined her. Yet with each passing year, her prayers went unanswered. The boy's eyes, once filled with innocence, now carried the same cold calculation she had once seen in her grandfather. The grandfather himself was growing older, slower, but no less proud. He still paraded the boy as proof of his legacy, still smiled that crooked smile at neighbors who crossed the street to avoid him. But time was not on his side. His body weakened, and for the first time, he was no longer the most powerful man in the household. The boy had grown taller, stronger, and with that strength came something else: defiance. And this is where the story turns. For years the grandfather had believed he was untouchable, that silence would protect him forever. But silence has limits. One night, in the blackness of winter, neighbors claimed they heard shouting from the house. Not the sharp cry of a girl trapped, but the deep booming clash of two men, the old and the young, the predator and his own creatio. What happened inside that house has never been written down, but by morning the grandfather was gone. Some said he fled, too ashamed to face the eyes of a town that had finally turned against him. Others whispered that he had been buried in secret, that the boy himself had become both executioner and heir. And though no body was ever found, his chair at church sat empty, and the smile that had haunted the community for decades was never seen again. The boy remained, taller, stronger, colder, a living reminder that the bloodline had devoured itself. And in his mother's silence, you could hear the truth. She knew the curse had only just begun. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? After the grandfather's disappearance, the boy's presence in town grew heavier, like a storm cloud that would not move. Some believed justice had finally come, that the old man's sins had been paid for in blood, but others whispered darker things, that evil never disappears, it only changes form. And when they looked at the boy, they swore they saw the same smirk, the same slow burning rage, waiting for a moment to be unleashed. His mother lived in near total silence. The years had taken her voice, not by force but by erosion, as if each word she never spoke had carved away a piece of her. To outsiders, she seemed like a shadow tethered to the earth, her body present but her spirit long gone. Those who dared approach her said she barely acknowledged them, her eyes always fixed somewhere far away. Yet when it came to her son, she remained devoted. No matter the fear he inspired, no matter the reminders he carried of her ruin, she clung to him as if he was her final tether to existence. The boy, now nearly a man, began to wander the outskirts of town at night. He was often seen standing in fields, staring into the distance as though listening to voices only he could hear. Animals avoided him. Farmers said their dogs howled when he passed. People whispered that he carried his grandfather's ghost inside him, that the sins of the father and the father's father had taken root in his blood. One autumn, a fire broke out in a barn on the edge of town. No one could prove it was him, but the footprints leading away from the ashes matched his size. Another season later, a young girl vanished on her way home from school. Search parties scoured the woods, but no trace was ever found. Suspicion hung over him like a funeral shroud, but with no evidence. The town could do nothing but tighten their doors and pray that the curse would pass them by. The family home itself became a place of dread. Its windows, once lit by lamps, grew dark. Weeds choked the garden, boards warped on the porch, and still the boy and his mother remained inside, living in shadows. Some swore they could hear her crying late at night, a low wail that carried across the hills, though others insisted it was not crying at all, but laughter tinged with madness. And so the story of this bloodline sank deeper into the soil. What had begun as whispers of scandal had transformed into legend, a tale parents told their children as warning. But for those who lived through it, it wasn't legend. It was the living memory of a family that had eaten itself alive, leaving behind only silence, suspicion, and scars that time would never erase. Generations later, the story still lingers, though the names have faded. Ask the oldest among the town, and you'll see it in their eyes. A reluctance to speak, a tightening of the jaw, a quick change of subject. They know, they remember, because some histories are not written in books, but in the way people avoid a house, in the way children are warned never to wander too far, in the way silence itself becomes tradition. For the woman at the center of it, no grave has ever been marked. Some say she wasted away inside that collapsing house, her body finally giving out after years of carrying shame heavier than flesh can bear. Others insist she left one night, vanishing into the hills, determined to outrun a past that had chained her since birth. No record confirms either fate. She simply dissolved into rumor, like mist at dawn. The boy, or the man he became, left a deeper scar. There were stories of him moving from town to town, working odd jobs, never staying long. In every place he carried with him the same unsettling aura, the kind that made neighbors lock their doors early. When crops failed or livestock went missing, whispers would circle, and before long he would vanish again, leaving fear behind like footprints in mud. No one knows where he died or if he left children of his own. Some believe his blood still runs quietly through unsuspecting veins today, hidden, waiting, like a sickness that has not yet bloomed. What makes this story most terrifying is not its grotesque details, but its silence. How many people saw the truth and chose to look away? How many neighbors heard the cries, saw the bruises, noticed the resemblances, and said nothing? Silence is the soil where curses grow, and this family's silence gave birth to a legacy that outlived them all, and maybe that is why the tale still clings like smoke to the bones of this place, because it forces us to ask the question no one wants to answer. If evil was festering next door, in the house just across the field, would we speak out? Or would we too choose silence and let history repeat itself? This has been one of the darkest family legacies ever unearthed, and perhaps the most haunting part is this: stories like this aren't rare, they're just buried, waiting,